Recently, I learned something kind of interesting about the 1979 movie Alien. This information actually comes by way of its 1986 sequel, Aliens. Sort of. So, in the background of one scene in Aliens, we can see profiles of the crew of the Nostromo from the first movie. I wouldn't even describe these as like blink and you might miss it moments, though, because they're almost impossible to actually read unless you're actively looking for something. It wasn't until 2003, when the Alien quadrilogy box set included the full images of these crew profiles as a special feature, that anyone could really even read these documents. In Joan Lambert's profile, she is described as being a Despin convert at birth, male to female. The profile also notes that there is, so far, no indication of suppressed trauma related to gender alteration. So, when I first read this, it was framed as part of this sort of revelation that Lambert is a trans woman, and I thought that that was really interesting given some of the themes of the movie Alien. I wanted to look more into it, but the couple of articles that I found either didn't really go into too much depth or got really weird really fast. So I wanted to give my own take on this new information and how it sort of fits in with some of the themes of the movie, and also talk about how it helps us engage with that age-old question, is Alien a queer text? Part 1. Definitions. So, before diving fully into this, I want to take some time to define some terms. This might get a little pedantic, but I think it'll be helpful to be extremely clear about what we're talking about. So, transgender is an adjective describing a person whose sex assigned at birth is different from their gender identity. And as I mentioned earlier, most people seem to have taken Lambert's profile to mean that she is a transgender woman. And while I think that reading Lambert as a trans woman is a valid analysis that can probably be well supported by the text, I don't necessarily think that that's what her profile is telling us. Even though it was through a different process than usual, Lambert was in fact assigned female at birth, and she still seems to identify as a woman during the events of Alien. It's important, too, to remember that the profile gives no insight into the nature of Lambert's surgery, except for this term Despin convert, which, as far as I can tell, is a made-up term for the film, suggesting that it's some kind of futuristic medical procedure. So, while she may have arrived at the female sex in an atypical way, we don't necessarily have enough details on the contemporary medicine to know whether her body is in any way distinguishable from a typical natal female. And more importantly, even though this was a non-consensual intervention at the time, it does still reflect her gender identity. I think if we had to find a real-life analog for Lambert's experience, like if I were being held at gunpoint and asked to do that for some reason, it would be closer to that of an intersex person. Intersex is an adjective describing a person whose physical characteristics at birth do not fit into one of the typical categories of male or female. For example, some people are born with genitals or gonads that do not fit into the typical male or female categories. And unfortunately, with alarming frequency, doctors will medically intervene in these situations to try to fix the person when they're a child or a baby with absolutely no ability to consent, even though often these procedures are not medically necessary and are also often not desired by the person later in life, which is completely horrifying. Other intersex people might have what would be considered typical sex characteristics while still having an atypical chromosome genotype associated with that. In the real world, many intersex people do not identify as trans. They often feel that the gender that was assigned to them is in line with their actual gender identity, or they just don't identify with transness for whatever other reason. That's not to say that they're not subject to other forms of discrimination. I mean, you don't really have to look much further than non-consensual irreversible surgery on babies, or that intersex people can't also identify as trans, but these are two separate identities that may or may not overlap. So again, the profile is pretty vague, and it's not clear if Lambert actually had some intersex characteristics that prompted the surgery, or if it was just some kind of logistical decision, like maybe this is the kind of dystopia where there's a shortage of women or something. But the important thing here is that having an involuntary surgery done to you as a baby doesn't automatically make you trans, and indeed it presents its own set of struggles that are distinct from those faced by the trans community and also the queer community in general. So I want to emphasize again that being intersex is not synonymous with being trans or with being queer, even though some intersex people may also identify with those labels. And I'll put some more material about this in the description. But there are some struggles that are shared by both trans and intersex people, namely, in this case, intense unwanted scrutiny and regulation over their sex characteristics. I think that's what's so frustrating about a lot of the articles that I encountered about this. Because whatever Lambert is, whether it's trans or intersex or just something else, it's invited audiences to imagine what her genitals must look like, and also very specifically what her anxieties must be about her genitals. And for all the violations done to their bodies, the male characters on screen never have their privacy violated in this way. There is no point while watching Alien where I wonder, how big is Dallas's penis? Or like, is Kane circumcised? That would be really weird. But just as Ripley's body is made into a spectacle for the audience, now Lambert too becomes an object that we might imagine naked. Part 2. Who is Lambert? If you haven't seen Alien, the basic plot is that while this ship is hauling space cargo back to Earth, the crew goes to investigate a radio signal from an unknown planet. One crew member ends up being attacked and impregnated by an alien, and its offspring terrorizes the rest of them until only one crew member remains, Ellen Ripley. This isn't really a spoiler, because Ripley is played by Sigourney Weaver, and while contemporary audiences may have been surprised to see this unknown actor become the main hero, now you watch it and you're just like, oh, it's Sigourney Weaver, I bet she's important. I don't know who John Hurt is. The foundation of Alien is its tense, psychosexual horror, which is in large part thanks to the designs of special effects artist H.R. Giger. Unfortunately, as a result, if you read any serious analysis of Alien, it's all just so unbelievably horny. Everything is a penis, or semen, or a vagina, and if it's a vagina, it probably has teeth, and is also a penis. Space is a womb. Ripley's nosebleed is menstrual, I guess, somehow. So, while I think that kind of analysis can get a bit over the top, obviously there are still a lot of visual references to sex and pregnancy in the movie, as well as phallic shapes, most notably in the xenomorph itself, which, come on, it has a penis head. So, a major theme of Alien is this crisis of masculinity. As the xenomorph drone stalks the crew of the Nostromo, men are suddenly penetrated and impregnated without consent, and the consequences are worse than death. As a character, Lambert acts as a sort of avatar for the audience. She behaves the way most reasonable people would if they were being hunted by a perfect killing machine with corrosive acid for blood. That is to say, she spends most of the movie screaming and trying to get off the ship. When she, Kane, and Dallas are initially investigating the alien signal picked up by the ship, Lambert is the one wisely griping that they should just leave.
Let's get out of here.
As the audience begins to experience fear, it becomes easy to identify with Lambert. Maybe we feel like she's kind of annoying, because she is, but at least she's believably mirroring our internal state, so we can find some common ground with her. But remember that Alien seeks mainly to terrify men. The movie subverts the typical horror movie rape scene by making men the victims of the sexual horrors that unfold. So even without knowing about Lambert's surgery, her character is already contributing to the crisis in masculinity. When the men in the audience feel afraid, often the only analog they see on screen for an unrepressed expression of that emotion is a woman. And now, Lambert is not just any woman, but a woman who had that role surgically imposed on her as a baby. It's like a double whammy of emasculation. This is further complicated by the fact that the crew of the Nostromo is largely androgynous. It's pretty rare for the gender of any crew member to be acknowledged at all. This is unsurprising, given that the script was written without any specific reference to the characters' genders. As far as the narrative is concerned, it doesn't even seem to matter what Lambert's gender or anatomy are, because apart from her reproductive capabilities, it doesn't really seem like those things would make that big of a difference in her life. She's just a trucker on a big space truck, subject to the same workplace hazards and ennui as her male counterparts. Because of this lack of distinction on the basis of sex, there are very few opportunities for the male characters in the film to reassert their gender or sexuality. In many movies, characters can defy gender roles only temporarily before either re-embracing the correct role or dying. For example, a male character can be effeminate and act kind of gay, as long as by the end of the movie he toughens up and pairs off with a woman. A female character may be unabashedly promiscuous, a character typically associated with masculinity, but she'll often die before the movie's end unless she is reformed. These transgressions are permissible because they ultimately allow the narrative to reassert the values they at first seem to destabilize. In Alien, men are not afforded many opportunities to reposition themselves as definitively male and heterosexual in relation to the female characters, because gender is basically a moot point. When they attempt to do so, for example, when Ash tries to literally shove a magazine down Ripley's throat for an audience of half-naked pinup posters, they often fail. So, in the universe of Alien, it seems like not that much weight is put into gender at all. After all, Lambert's surgery was done when she was a baby, which suggests that it wasn't so much an expression of her gender identity as it was a decision made by some third party, either arbitrarily or for some logistical reason. Well, as I'm saying all this, there's this question that keeps sticking out at me. Isn't everyone's gender kind of arbitrary or just a matter of logistics? Part 3. Is gender arbitrary? The genetic lottery doles out sex chromosomes randomly in order to create a diverse and healthy population that is capable of sustaining itself. And because of the way that our human society has organized itself, we use our best guesses at what those sex chromosomes are in order to place individuals into the social categories of man and woman. Never mind that most people never even learn their actual chromosome genotype. But we don't actually generally get to place ourselves into those categories. Other people do it for us before we can even understand what they're doing. And by the time that we do start to figure out whether or not we agree with that assessment, we've already spent a lot of time with people around us reinforcing it. And for intersex people, that reinforcement may not be just social, but also physical changes. But if someone does determine that they actually fit into a different category, or maybe no category at all, they'll be met with a lot of resistance from the people around them, saying, you have to stay with the one that somebody picked for you, sorry, no take-backsies.
Facts don't care about your feelings.
Etc. So it's hard to deny that these categories mean a lot to us, whether we agree with them or not. And that's why people can often become invasive when they learn that somebody's body doesn't necessarily fit into their categories. Having these categories called into question can be a disturbing experience. For one thing, it's always challenging to have to incorporate new information into your worldview, but it's especially challenging when that information in particular disrupts what you thought was an immutable aspect of your identity. In this case, that disruption is coming in the context of somebody having a non-consensual surgery done to them as a baby. I mentioned earlier that the script for Alien had no gender markers and specified that the characters were all written as unisex, which is very cool and sexy of them, except it's not exactly true. The movie's goal of sexually terrifying young men wouldn't really work if there were no men on screen to be sexually terrorized. If the crew were all women, for example, there would be little to differentiate Alien from other slashers of the same period. It just becomes another rape fantasy. Gender in Alien is simultaneously extremely present, but also not present at all. That is, it is only present insofar as the audience brings their preconceptions about gender into the narrative. They may be prodded along in that direction by the rife sexual imagery, but not by the actions of the characters themselves. As we've established, gender has a minimal impact on how characters behave, but the tension between the dominance of the masculine-feminine dichotomy in our real lives and the absence of that dichotomy in Alien is exactly what helps to terrify the audience. When we see representations of gender that do not fit into our categories, we get stressed, because maybe that means that we also don't fit into these categories as perfectly as we thought. Part 4. Is Alien a queer text? Although we've established that Lambert might not be a trans woman exactly, I think it's fair to say that that is where most people's minds go when they read her profile. And for a movie made in 1979 and then maybe retconned in 1986, it's not the worst trans representation ever, even if it fundamentally mischaracterizes what it means to be trans. Obviously, it's something that's barely there. I don't even really know if anybody even caught it before the profile was isolated for the DVD release, but the information about Lambert's gender isn't treated as though her womanhood is a deception or a ruse, even though it's called unnatural. The text treats it as something fairly normal. Ironically, the fact that the framing fails to foreground the information at all also contributes to the sense of normalcy about Lambert's gender. Subtextually, it's thematically relevant, as we've discussed, but textually, it's just not that big of a deal. And that's a lot better than what we got for the next couple of decades of characters that are read as trans. Characters whose entire identities are centered around their trans status as a metaphor for moral transgression. That said, considering the dearth of depictions of anything but typical cisgender men and women, and the general lack of intersex and trans voices in mainstream media at the time of the creation of both Alien and Aliens, it's not altogether surprising that the filmmakers were not entirely sensitive in their thematic uses of gender. Why is the absence of gender so terrifying to us? Why is it the aspect of emasculation specifically that makes sexual violence resonate more in a way that it doesn't when it's done to women? The answer to these questions is the same reason that the filmmakers thought that Lambert's gender might contribute to the terror of the film, and the same reason that we have to see Ripley objectified to resolve the narrative. Most audiences become uncomfortable when gender becomes too hazy, because it challenges some of the categories that lie at the core of our society. And that brings us back to Aliens. Remember that the information that Lambert had sex reassignment surgery is not revealed until this sequel, and while it may mesh nicely with the themes of Alien, it seems that Aliens wants to backpedal on some of the assertions of the arbitrariness of gender. We still see a lot of androgyny among the Space Marines. They do have a lot of highly sexualized dialogue, but it's made fairly equally across gender lines. And Vasquez is just one of the guys. They even have this line where they're very dismissive of the idea of gender in another alien race. Albeit it's, played for laughs.
The one that you had was male.
It doesn't matter when it's Arcturian, baby.
But they all die. It's not until Ripley finally reasserts herself as a maternal figure by destroying the non-maternal mother alien that the movie can reach its resolution and the humans can be saved from the xenomorphs once and for all. Or so they think. I really don't know. There's 12 sequels. I've only seen these 2 movies. Aliens seems to say, look where gender ambiguity got you. Lambert is dead. The entire crew is dead except for Ripley. She alone survived, first to become an object of relief for the audience, and then finally to triumphantly slot herself into the role of mother, superseding the inherently genderless mother of the Nostromo. But, it's still feminism because she's a strong female character. She calls the alien a bitch, you guys, come on. So, is Alien a queer text? I think Alien forces us to question our gender categories, and in a subtle and maybe unintentional way, comments on homophobia, transphobia, and intersex discrimination by forcing us to reckon with why we are especially disturbed by sexual violence that is coded as homosexual and by representations of gender that do not fit into our existing categories. But it does so in ways that are sometimes reinforcing the same structures that are being critiqued. Meanwhile, I think that Aliens, while being an excellent action movie, is a little disappointing in the way that it tries to reassert heteropatriarchy by making Ripley a mom and not a lesbian. So, yes, but also, no. I don't know who John Hurt is.